back of the school, keeping their heads down and out of reach, near the bins full of sick and school dinners. At the bottom of the food chain with a
freaks. So that's what they call us.
I worked very briefly on a film that was a third green screen, and in the process ended up having a conversation in a pub with the producer, and we were just kind of both saying, isn't it bizarre that almost exclusively the use of visual effects and CGI is about creating kind of physical worlds that feel like they belong on the other side of a lens, you know, that they are kind of representational of another reality.
CGI was tending to be used to replicate realities that, for whatever reason, were impossible to recreate yourselves. And we felt that while that's very valid and very good, it would be much more interesting to use the technology as part of the storytelling process and to explore ways of using the advances in computers and the software to help us tell the story.
Working with Kit and knowing Kit for a number of years, one of the things is that we were always looking for a piece that we wanted to do within a green screen environment. So therefore we had to find the right piece of work. And part of the work we do at Pilot is always looking for that work for that particular audience, that genre of audience. And so I was reading books and reading things, and came across this particular book that had just been published. It was Guardian Book of the Month. It was one of the kind of key young adult fiction pieces of work. And this was the right medium for this particular piece of work. So The Knife That Killed Me lent itself particularly to be told in a sort of a theatrical way, but in a cinematic form.
When we shot it, we had a script, we had an idea about where it was heading. We'd had actually some mood boards and stuff we created that actually ended up looking, the end product looked very similar. But in order to get from the shoot to the finished 90 minutes was a journey of kind of constant kind of sculpting, throwing away, restarting, rebuilding, remaking. And I don't think for us at that time with this film it could have been done any other way.
The casting was really interesting and really exciting. We saw lots of extraordinarily and brilliantly talented young performers. We shot everything on camera as well, so we were there to be able to take things with people looking straight down the lens and firing monologues and doing improvisations, and being able to do sort of impro and stuff on the floor during the rehearsal and during the audition process. So every single person was also given a bit of script, but then also asked to impro around it, because we also knew we wanted the opportunity for someone to be able to be playful and also creative with us on the floor when we got in the studio.
It was difficult. Sometimes we'd do a scene and the character you're playing against wasn't even in the same room. But because we'd all workshopped it for a week, because we'd kind of gone through everything we wanted to go through, we knew how the other character would be playing it. So kind of it would have been weird if we were both coming at it at two different angles, but because we both knew what we were doing and we'd done it a few times before, I think we get away with it in the film. I think it looks great.
What they always did was they set the scene up first in the green room, and we did the scene as a group, and then they took everybody out one by one. So we'd already sort of rehearsed and maybe done a couple of takes of the scene, with Bates and Miller, Roth, Bates and Miller. So when I was doing scenes with them, we did the scene, so I was interacting with them, and then they took them out, and it was just a case of just trying to replicate that way of working.
All the classroom scenes, there's rows of 4 tables, and we shot one row at a time and layered them in the final edit.
In some ways, it was very liberating, but also it was so vast because the possibilities weren't finite. You could say, well, we could do anything, and the beauty is always in the edit, in terms of being able to say, well, okay, well, if we can do all those things, what are the bits that most help us to fit the narrative?
Obviously, we chose Knife as a story because it's this inner kind of conversation, really, inner monologue of a kid who we think is dead, and the language seemed to fit the story well.
In a book, you open the pages, and the moment you read I, everything is how you put yourself in that position, and any references to anything that's ever happened to you, you feel it and you see it as you did and experience it. And I think the moment you point a camera at something else, it becomes whatever else that is. So, for example, with the knife. If we had gone and shot the knife in a real playground in a school, it would have been somebody else's playground, not my playground when I was growing up. But when I read the book, it was absolutely where I went to school as I read it. And so I think, you know, in that first-person narrative and Paul telling a story from his memories, it allowed us this freedom to say, well, okay, we can step away from trying to recreate a reality that isn't ours, it's somebody else's.
The unique thing about The Knife That Killed Me and what made it enjoyable for us as a team was it was a very collaborative, iterative process. And we could come in and basically start the day not knowing what a shot was going to look like. And by the end of the day, you know, have put together a scene and really brought it to life. And that was a really kind of intriguing and you know, enjoyable process for all of us, I think.
The traditional way was you make the film and you hand it to your visual effects house. And there might be a visual effects supervisor on set saying you can do this, you can't do that, and whatever. But here we were literally doing the whole thing with the visual effects team being part of the process as we were filming. So persuading people that's how you're going to do it was actually impossible because they couldn't visualize it either. And I defy anybody to look back and say they could visualize what we were going to have at the outset.
Could be worse as hells go. I always thought hell would burn you. But it's freezing cold in here.
You know, because we've all made films before, we assume that that part of the process would be very similar. We would shoot the footage and composite our bits together, and then we'd be able to edit. The problem is that because none of the shots were made in camera, there was nothing for an editor to look at until we'd done quite a lot of the compositing work. And you didn't want to do a lot of the compositing work until you knew which shots you were using because it's time-consuming and expensive. So our sort of iterative process, as we ended up calling it, this sculptural process of cutting our film or piecing our film together, chipping away at the block, ended up that the edit sort of formed part of the compositing, and it was over a very long period of time. And as a consequence, Kit and myself ended up largely putting the film together and editing the film. And certainly for the future, that's something we need to crack.
We worked with an amazing illustrator, Stuart Ord, and we'd been working with him for a year prior to that, doing all the pre-visualization. So we knew the kind of the color palette and the emblematic nature of the work. So it's very sort of monochromatic, and with the numbers of bits of color we had were the repeating images of the red roses, which would appear on the wallpaper and the curtains, and every character having them in the bins. All of those sort of things we were able to play with it, and we knew what that was going to look like because it was actually going to be quite dark.
The biggest challenge for me is my background's in traditional art. Not a lot of the stuff I do is digital, so taking my traditional drawings, all done by hand on paper, and then putting those into the computer and putting them into the film, that needed quite a lot of work, quite a lot of kind of relearning what I do. And because we're dealing with white lines on a black background, that meant a lot of the work I did on paper had to be inverted.
Various advances in technology, you know, lightweight cameras in the 60s meant we kind of left the studio and went out on location and made some fantastic films that were location based. And all I think we're saying is that while that's great, some of the old studio-based movies were fantastic because they were actually quite theatrical and they were very obviously, this is make-believe and here we are telling you a story.
It was about putting the whole thing together to make something that is unique, as you know, and it's great that the Times recognised it, gave it 4 stars as nothing you'll ever see. The Rome International Film Festival recognised it as something very different, and in fact introduced it to the jury to say why they wanted to put on this enormous screen in Rome was that because it was something very, very different. And it's starting to build up a momentum.
It was the knife that killed me. There's no knife here now to cut me down.
spirit of wrath lives here and it battles for my soul. And I don't know who'll win.